Good afternoon again, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share with you my sort of reflections on what I saw in Liberia as part of my experience being there for 2 years. And so I'm here so much to learn from academics to sort of see what I can sort of incorporate into my paper, which reflects on what the Ebola crisis between 2014 to 2015, one could even go all the way to 2016. What sort of lessons were drawn from the response and in terms of building social cohesion, social capital, community resilience, but also collective resilience, and what that means for other processes that Liberia or any other country with different sort of element of fragility is facing. And so I was there for 2 years, as I was sort of saying to some people before. I was there for 2 years working with civil society organizations to help them, not help them, but really to facilitate the process of them being active and participants into transitional justice and national reconciliation sort of mechanisms, which were part of the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As you could imagine, as soon as the Ebola crisis occurred, civil society organizations had to sort of divert their efforts, but also the UN peacekeeping. So you have 7,000 armed personnel, and more than 2,500 police officers, but also around 2,000 civilian peacekeepers, but also UN country teams, so UNDP, WHO, UNICEF, and other UN agencies and funded programs. Now, as many of you would know, this is a small country which had a number of structural vulnerabilities, and I think that's where my paper sort of begins to sort of show, the list of structural vulnerabilities. So lack of certain things that are so important for any country to adequately respond to those challenges. Thankfully, the UN was there and therefore could utilize the resources that they were using already for peacekeeping sort of purposes and use those resources, but also the energies, the time to respond to a crisis that the Liberian government, the Liberian community alone, or community members and civil society groups could not have achieved. You've got a real issue of decentralization or sort of overly sort of centralized decision-making sort of systems or processes that were existent in Liberia for more than 100 years. You had pretty much the center and the periphery were not connected, even physically speaking. Roads were not there in many parts of the country, and you had pretty much a long history of mistrust. Because of the civil war, but also before that, the way states and society sort of interacted. You have, all those sort of systems. And of course, you have also health systems and other service, social services not being adequately sort of governed. Yeah, and you have a strong sort of UN sort of presence, which it has been trying to sort of build the capacity of the Liberian sort of community with those sort of constraints in mind, i.e. resources, but also other sort of challenges around mining companies, so natural resource sort of companies that were pretty much in everyday sort of conflicts with communities over concession agreements that were signed with the participation of some community members and so on and so forth. Yeah. So the crisis itself begins with highlighting a major challenge. The crisis, the Ebola crisis I'm talking about, begins in sort of March April 2014. And already, you know, the idea that it originated from a neighboring country, i.e. Guinea, already presents us with one challenge, which is, you know, anyone with Guinean sort of a background would be targeted as a potential sort of source of the Ebola. Yeah? So the process of othering kicks in, and so most of the people who are from Guinea who sort of migrated to Liberia as part of long-term migration, as in, you know, 100 or 200 or 300 years of migration. These are the Mandingo sort of people. So already you start seeing this sort of process of saying Mandingos are not Liberians. Mandingos are the problems, and Mandingos are here to take our jobs, and so on and so forth. So, you know, that's one challenge that the UN had to deal with. The liberal, good civil society actors also had to play their role. Government institutions had to also play their role in saying everyone is a citizen. There's no foreigner, non-foreigner in this battle against. And it worked. And but of course, you know, you had to use modern means of peacekeeping, modern peacekeeping, as in fourth or fifth generation sort of peacekeeping mechanisms to maintain the peace, to guard borders, to also manage information. And so I personally was one of the radio presenters for the French radio, so Guinea being French-speaking, Ivory Coast being French-speaking. On the other side, you had a shortage of sort of French sort of peace, French-speaking UN peacekeepers. So from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. I worked as a peacekeeper and a civilian peacekeeper, and from 8 till 10 I worked as a radio presenter. So I'll take all the French news or the English news, put them into French for the French-speaking communities living in Liberia. So Ivory Coast sort of migrants, but also refugees, Guinean migrants, but also one could say travelers and workers, migrant workers. Liberia had some, you know, job opportunities that were not available in other parts of Guinea or Sierra Leone. The second part of my paper sort of looks at how did this process of realizing, you know, these sort of aha moments, how were these insights sort of triggered to sort of realize that some of the social cohesion sort of results or indicators that you could see as part of the successful fight against Ebola, how did you know, how did the international community start sort of coming to realize that you know, these processes could also be used to continue with key national reform processes. In 2014 or 13, there was supposed to be some sort of debate on the referendum, on the constitutional referendum, and so the constitution had to be amended. One of the key interesting sort of issue that was introduced, which I'll use as an example to sort of look at how Sustainable Development Goals could sort of learn from this process in terms of implementation at not only the Liberian case, but also other cases where you have different forms of crisis occurring simultaneously or concomitantly. You have one sort of issue that we don't know how it came to be. You know, civil society groups, including some state elites, started sort of supporting this idea that Liberia should mention in its constitution, in its new constitution, that it's a Christian nation. Everyone was shocked, including some Liberian sort of elites who could not understand that you know, a country that is in a region, but also in a world of diversity, of embracing all different forms of faith, not only the major Abrahamic faith, but also other faiths that one could sort of expect Liberia to have that go through. Now, there was so much resistance, as you can imagine, the UN being one of the key actors that could resist. And in the end, you know, the strategy was pretty much to delay that debate and to control sort of communication so that that idea could not flourish. Partly because you have a recipe for pretty much problematic relations between two communities that have been living in harmony for centuries. What does that mean then for SDGs sort of 16? If we just take that as one example. For a community that had come together to fight against Ebola, you know, how can, could, sort of the international community, but also the national actors, state and non-states, could sort of, sort of draw certain sort of element of the participatory sort of approaches that the Ebola crisis response had generated, or sort of allowed to push to the surface to be used for those sort of processes of national reconciliation, but particularly through specific sort of examples such as this particular mention in the preamble that Liberia should be a Christian nation, for example. The other sort of major challenge that was there, I'll finish on this, which continues to be a key sort of problem for not only Liberia, but in many parts of the world, is domestic violence, but also sexual and gender-based violence. Together with that, you know, the other traditional sort of harmful practices, such as female genital mutilation. Liberia has, you know, sort of alarming sort of statistics. The practice is prevalent in many villages, and as I said, you know, the fact that you have pretty much the police has a very limited reach into rural areas, and the rural areas are the bigger part of the country. You have a challenge there where SDGs 16, or the actors that are responsible in implementing, but also in reporting on the achievement of the SDGs, particularly SDG 16, have difficulties in reporting and using certain elements of the Ebola response into the platforms for addressing some of the SDG challenges. Thank you.